Good evening. Today we're going to be looking into the eightfold path to more effective problem solving and specifically looking at step 4, selecting a criteria. This will be a chapter review from a practical guide for policy analysis from the Bradish book. So before we get to the fourth step, let's just review the steps that have been gone over so far. So step number 1 is to define the problem. Before we start doing a policy analysis, we have to define the problem that we're trying to address. In this, it could be your problem is there are too many homeless families in the LA area, and come up with a policy analysis that will identify and address this. Now, keeping with that theme, let's move on to step 2, assembling some evidence. In this step, you're going to have to start researching different aspects of the policy analysis. So collecting both data and information. Now remember, data is the cold facts, so just straight numbers, whereas information is data that has meaning to it, so it has some explanation on the data. Here you can also see best practices of other programs, other policies that are addressing this issue. So again, keeping with the homeless families in the LA area, we can start assembling the evidence. How many homeless families are in the LA area? Maybe how many are homeless status for more than 6 months, for a year or more. What type of resources are these families using? Are these productive? Are they getting off of these assistance programs into sustainable housing? So this is where you're starting to see that evidence and start to collect it so that when you're doing a policy analysis, you have that information readily available. Now, once you collect this information, you move on to step 3, which is constructing the alternatives. Here you look at what other policies are in effect or could be an alternative to this policy. Here you really want to broaden your research, really broaden what policies you're looking at, and as you go through to narrow your alternatives. Now during this time, you're not exactly putting different policies against each other to figure out which one is a better option or if they're mutually exclusive. At this point, you're just trying to see what other policies are out there, what other things maybe have been constructed around this problem, about this policy problem that you've identified. With this, sometimes it means that you're looking at one policy action more over the other, or to mitigate a problem. You're just really looking at what's out here. And again, this is the best place to start looking at best practices. Again, keeping with the homeless families in the LA area. Is there a current policy that has an effect? In the recent years, last year, there have been different policies put down by California legislation that actually requires community colleges to provide certain resources for homeless students, and being a community college, it is open to the community. Now this would be maybe one way you could address the problem of homelessness, by having community resources and have different ones like that. Again, they do not have to be mutually exclusive. Now we move into the criteria we're going to be reviewing tonight, which is select the criteria. Now that you have your problem, now that you've researched it, and now that you see other policies that address this issue, now you're going to start looking at what we can use to actually see if this policy is working. Now, with doing the criteria, this doesn't mean you're judging the alternate policies, but you're actually looking at the projected outcomes of your policy that you're doing your analysis on. So let's move. So first we're going to look at the commonly used criteria when doing a policy analysis. The first one is hitting the target. With this, it's really good for mobilization for political or resource reasons. This one's usually, let's meet a certain target by this date. Keeping with the homeless families in LA, this would be, we want to decrease families needing homelessness services by 25% by December 2018. This would mobilize people to bring the resources. And I would say that California actually is addressing these, again, as I mentioned, through different policies being put in place through different community centers and community resources. So again, hitting the target is really good to get that focus started, to get the resources started to flow, and to start your really the problem that you're looking at, to really have the focus on it. Then we move into efficiency. This criteria is often used, or it looks at a policy in reference to how it serves all of the community or all the people affected by this problem. So with this, we're looking at, now with dealing with criteria, we also have to do an evaluation of their weight. So when we list all the criteria of how we're evaluating this policy, we need to look at how much does that particular criteria weigh against the other criterias. Should this policy still be enforced, or should it be held back? What should we do? So one of the ways to weight the criteria is to look at the political process. Does that just take care of it? And meaning, does one law supersede another? Does the policy overweigh another policy already there? So this one is usually done primarily with the analysis employer or client, especially because they know where the influence is and all that. They do that with the analysis. Now I say that because the second point is the analysis imposes a solution. So I went over political process. Now we're moving to the analysis imposes a solution. So in this approach, the analysis themselves assigns a weight that maybe the employer or the client gave, but they're using it more as a reference, and then they're going to put their own weight on it to get the solution. So again, looking at the political process way of weighting the criteria, we're looking at governmental or political processes that weight the criteria. In the analysis imposed, we're looking at the outside perspective, and the analysis modifies the weight that was assigned by the employer or client. One thing I'd like to point out with this one is I really like the example again given in the book, where it gives you, hey, let's weight this criteria out. We have Route A. Route A, if we build a highway and we take Route A, we're going to displace 30 families. And of those 30 families, or we're going to displace all of them, and so with Route A, let's say that we have 30 homes, and the railroad will impose a $20 million more construction cost than Route B, because Route A will spare the 30 homes, half of them that have lived there for 10 years, and we're offering $30,000 per family compensation if they move. Of them, only 10 are unhappy. So as an analysis, do we look at, all right, save the 20 million or 10 unhappy families? We have to, again, look at it on what's the best, not necessarily maybe the net price, but what's the best for the underrepresented, those that are in that area. And then lastly, we have the distribution of rights. So this one is when we're weighting policies, are we trumping a right? Are we invading some type of right? Like if we have a cell phone policy, no, having the right to have a cell phone out in the open and conversations out in the open. Do you have a right to the cell phone, or do you have the right not to be disturbed as someone? So we're looking at different people's right. Which one is weighted higher than the other when we're looking at different policies? How can we help with that with our analysis? And then we look at the book looked at the commonly used practical criteria. So looking at policies and all that, what is the most practical criteria to use with it? So with the first one, legality, we got to make sure that the policy does not violate any laws. We can't go against a law that is in place. What's interesting is to, to think of that and to look at like marijuana laws, where states have their laws and the feds have another law. The fed is the, federal law is the law of the land, and the states only have certain jurisdiction. So it's interesting to look at that policy and how that's legally kind of in a gray area. A second one, political acceptance. So the policy must be politically accepted. And this is saying you basically don't want too much opposition or too little support. Now, I think a great example of this right now is Trump Care and how many tries that has been going through the House. It's this particular policy as often has too much opposition and too little support. So we can see that it's not moving anywhere because those that can vote on it aren't making any moves on it because it doesn't meet their criteria for their representation, for their constituents. We also look at the administrative robustness and provability. Does this policy, do we have the administration to actually carry out this policy? Can we actually have this policy administered by our different either agencies or however it is implemented? And then lastly, the policy sustainability. Will this policy actually stick? Will it endure? Will it, go past maybe a year or two? And just, when we're looking at these practical criteria, we're looking at what happens to really like an alternate policy moves through policy adaptation and policy implementation. So we're kind of looking forward. If this policy is put forth, will it pass these tests? Will it actually meet these criteria to have a chance to go through the political process? And then lastly, just a couple of points to wrap up step 4. We're looking at criteria as logical constructs, right? So when we're looking at criteria, we're making sure our principal objective is being maximized. And what do I mean by that? Basically, our problem is being identified and addressed at its best way, at most maximized. Again, with problem of homeless families, are we minimizing the homeless families? Are we actually accomplishing that? Is our criteria actually work to address that and have the policy analysis correctly? So we're looking at that. We want to make sure that specific metrics are used. So that metrics are used to quantify, or not used to quantify, but to clarify. Are we actually explaining what we are accomplishing or what we'd like to accomplish with this policy? And then lastly, we want to make sure that we avoid any confusing alternatives and criteria. So we want to make sure that alternatives are courses of action, the criteria are mental states of evaluating the results of these actions. So with our alternatives, we're looking at different policies, we're looking at different ways to address our problem, whereas criteria, we're actually thinking about the standard of evaluating maybe this alternative or evaluating the policy and how it addresses the problem that we first identified in step 1. That is all I have for you for step 4, identifying your criteria. I hope you enjoyed it, and good luck.